The scissors crunched, and the first piece of her fell to the dirt. It was a thick black lock of hair, shiny as a raven's wing, and it lay there in the dust like a dead thing. The crowd gasped. Not a quiet gasp, but a sharp, hungry one. The sound of a beast getting its first taste of blood. Leora didn't move. She just sat on the splintered crate they'd shoved under her, her wrists burning where the coarse rope bit into her skin. Her jaw was a knot of stone. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. The barber's hand was shaking. He was a small man, a man used to trimming beards and giving shaves, not shearing a woman like a sheep in the middle of the street. But Sheriff Hale was standing right behind him, and the sheriff's glare was hotter than the noon sun. So the barber snipped again. Another piece fell, and another. "Vanity stripped clean," Sheriff Hale boomed, his voice thick with a satisfaction that turned Leora's stomach. "So the town may see her for what she is." What was she? She was a woman who held her head high, a woman who didn't bow and scrape. In this town, that was a crime worse than murder. "She thought herself too fine," a woman sneered from the crowd. "Let's see her smile now," a man cackled. A grubby little boy darted out from between his mother's legs. He snatched one of the fallen locks from the ground, waved it like a scalp, and then threw it back down, grinding it into the filth with the heel of his boot. The crowd roared with laughter. It was a cruel, ugly sound that echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. The barber, emboldened by the noise, started cutting faster, hacking off jagged chunks. The beautiful long hair her mother had told her was her crown, her memory, her dignity, was now just a pile of trash at her feet. Leora squeezed her eyes shut. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "Never cut it, my love. It carries our story." The memory was a knife twisting in her gut. From the saloon, a drunk hollered, "Cut it all! Leave her bare as shame itself!" The last long piece fell, and then there was silence, a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the scrape of boots on the dirt road, grinding her story into nothing. Her head felt light, naked. The air felt cold and sharp against her scalp. She trembled, a violent shudder that racked her whole body, but she kept her spine straight. Her bound hands were clenched into fists so tight her knuckles were white. The sheriff pointed at the shorn pile. "There lies her pride," he announced. "Let the wind carry it. She has nothing left." He shoved her off the crate. She fell to her knees, right into the middle of her own ruined hair. Dust puffed up around her, and strands clung to her tear-streaked face. The crowd hooted and hollered. A sharp sting on her shoulder. A boy had thrown a stone. She swayed but didn't fall. Sheriff Hale folded his arms, a smug look on his face. The humiliation was complete. His power was absolute. But just as the roar of the crowd reached its peak, a shadow fell across the edge of the street. A tall man had stopped where the boardwalk met the dusty road. He wasn't looking at the sheriff. He wasn't looking at the jeering mob. His eyes were fixed on the hair, the pile of black silk and dust at Leora's knees. He didn't move. He just stood there, a silhouette against the blinding sun. But his stillness had a weight to it, a weight that began to quiet the crowd, one person at a time. A ripple of unease spread through the street. Leora couldn't see him clearly through her blurred vision, but she felt it, a change in the air, a shift in the very ground beneath her knees. The stranger took a step. His boots made a soft thud in the thick dust. He walked slowly, deliberately, right into the center of the square. He didn't spare a single glance for Sheriff Hale, who was now watching him with narrowed eyes. He stopped right in front of Leora. The crowd held its breath. What was he going to do? Spit on her? Throw another stone? He did something no one expected. He bent down. He knelt in the dirt, right there with her. His broad shoulders blocked the crowd's view of her, creating a small, quiet space in the middle of the chaos. His hands, calloused and rough from work, reached for the fallen strands. Gently, carefully, he began to gather her hair from the dust. The crowd erupted in confused hisses. "What's he doing? Leave it! It's filth!" He ignored them. His movements were slow, methodical. He picked up each lock, brushing away the grit, his touch as reverent as if he were handling spun gold. He gathered the strands that had been ground underfoot, pulling them from the dirt with a patience that was a silent rebuke to the town's frantic cruelty. Leora stared, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart, which had been a cold, dead stone in her chest, gave a painful lurch. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever stood for her. And now this stranger was on his knees in the dirt beside her, cradling the pieces of her shame like they were precious. He must be mad, a woman scoffed, touching something that's been cursed. Sheriff Hale's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. Get up, cowboy. That dirt isn't yours to clean. The stranger didn't even look up. He just continued his task, his rough palm sweeping every last strand into his grasp. The jeers began to falter, replaced by a tense, confused silence. His quiet dignity was more unsettling than any threat. Leora found her voice, a hoarse whisper. Why? He didn't answer. He simply pressed the collected hair together, tucking the loose ends into the bundle in his hand, as if he were mending a shattered thing. The crowd, angered by his silence, pushed closer. A boy tried to dart forward and stomp on the remaining strands, but the cowboy's head snapped up. His eyes were dark as a thunderhead, and the boy froze, stumbling backward without a word. A wave of fear, real and cold, washed over the onlookers. This man's calm was more dangerous than any rage they had ever seen. Sheriff Hale stepped down from the saloon porch, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His face was a mask of fury. Last warning, stranger. Leave it in the dirt, or you'll lie there too. The threat hung in the hot, still air. Leora felt a tremor run through her. Part of her wanted him to run, to save himself. But another fiercer part of her prayed he would stay, that he would finish what he had started. The cowboy's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained on his task. He gathered the last few strands and then, slowly, he rose to his full height. He was a tall man, and his shadow fell over Leora like a shield. He clutched the bundle of her hair against his chest. The entire street had fallen silent. The only sound was the creak of a distant wagon and the lazy flap of a torn banner in the wind. In his silence, there was a defiance louder than any shout. Sheriff Hale's spurs jingled as he strode into the street, closing the distance between them. His hand was no longer resting on his gun. It was gripping it. You've made a mistake, stranger, he snarled. That filth you're holding belongs in the gutter. Drop it now, or I'll put you in the dirt beside it. The cowboy finally lifted his gaze from the hair in his hands. His eyes met the sheriff's. They were calm, steady, and held no trace of fear. That unflinching stare seemed to rattle Hale more than any weapon could. What's your name? The sheriff demanded, trying to reclaim his authority. The man's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Colt Mercer. The name meant nothing to most, but a few old-timers in the crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers of a man with that name, a man who didn't back down, had drifted in from the cattle trails. Hale sneered. Well, Mercer, you're about to be a forgotten name. I said drop it. Colt's fingers tightened around the hair. His boots were planted in the dust as if he'd grown from the earth itself. No. The word was quiet, but it hit the square like a physical blow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's hand twitched, his knuckles white on the grip of his revolver. But he didn't draw. Not yet. The town was watching too closely. He needed them to see this stranger as the aggressor, not himself. Leora's breath hitched. She had never heard a single word hold so much power. It wasn't a defiance born of anger. It was a statement of fact, as simple and unmovable as a mountain. You think one word makes you stronger than the law? Hale spat, stepping closer until he was invading Colt's space. That hair is nothing. The woman it came from is less than nothing. A fresh wave of shame and rage burned in Leora's chest, but Colt's reply was as calm and cool as Riverstone. If it was nothing, he said, his voice level, you wouldn't fear me holding it. The truth of it landed hard. Heads turned. Doubt flickered in the eyes of the townsfolk. The sheriff's carefully constructed theater of humiliation was starting to crumble. Hale's face went purple. He'd lost control of the narrative. With a roar of pure frustration, he ripped the revolver from its holster. The gleam of polished steel in the sun sent a shockwave through the crowd. Leora cried out, but her voice was lost in the collective gasp. The sheriff leveled the barrel right at Colt Mercer's chest. The hammer clicked back with a sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the square. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. The gun, the hair, the dust. Sheriff Hale's finger was tight on the trigger. The entire town held its breath, waiting for the explosion that would end it all. The sheriff's hand was shaking. Just a little, but everyone saw it. Sweat beaded on his temple, a telltale sign that this was about fear, not justice. "Drop it, Mercer!" Hale's voice cracked. "Or I swear to God, this dirt drinks your blood." Colt didn't even glance at the gun aimed at his heart. His eyes stayed locked on the sheriff's. "You can shoot me, Sheriff," he said, his voice impossibly calm. "But even if I fall, these won't scatter where you want them. They'll stay." He lifted the bundle of hair slightly. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The simple gesture seemed to drain the power from the sheriff's weapon. It made the gun look small, desperate. Hale jabbed the revolver forward. "Don't test me." But Colt didn't flinch. Leora watched, tears finally stinging her eyes. It wasn't pity she saw in this stranger's stance. It was a strength she had never known, a stillness that was a force of nature, and it shook her to her very core. "Shoot him already!" a voice yelled from the saloon. A few nervous laughs followed, trying to break the spell of dread that had fallen over the square. The sheriff's finger tightened. The hammer was back. The end was a fraction of a second away. And then a new voice cut through the tension. A woman in the crowd. "He won't shoot," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "He knows we've all seen too much." Every head turned. The sheriff's face went from purple to a blotchy, furious red. Being called out, having his bluff exposed in front of the whole town, was worse than any insult. He swung the barrel of the gun toward the voice in the crowd. In that split second of distraction, Colt moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't charge. He simply took one step forward. The move was so unexpected, it made the crowd gasp and shrink back. He closed the distance, his body now a shield in front of Leora. His shadow fell over her, and for the first time since the scissors had started their work, she felt a flicker of safety. Colt's voice was like iron. "If the law in this town is shame and cruelty, Sheriff, then that badge on your chest is nothing but a piece of tin." The words struck home. Whispers erupted, nods of agreement. The sheriff's authority, built on fear and intimidation, was dissolving right before his eyes. Hale's hand shook violently now. The gun wavered. "One more step," he stammered, his threat dying in his throat. Because Leora was moving, trembling, weak, but with a fire in her eyes, she pushed herself up from her knees. The ropes cut into her wrists, her shorn head was a ragged mess. But she stood. She stood tall. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried across the silent square. "Then shoot us both," she said, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "But you'll never cut me smaller than you already are." The words hung in the air like a final judgment. The crowd was utterly still, and for the first time Sheriff Hale looked well and truly lost. His gun wavered, not from a threat, but from the crushing weight of his own tyranny collapsing in on him. He was a king whose subjects had just remembered he was only a man. He knew he couldn't win with a gun anymore. Not now. So he changed the weapon. With a snarl, he shoved the pistol back into its holster. "Bring me a torch," he roared at his deputies. "If her pride won't burn from her head, we'll burn it from the ground." A new kind of shock went through the crowd. This was a different level of cruelty. A collective gasp was followed by a few sick, eager laughs from the darkest corners of the mob. One of the deputies, a young man eager to please, ran toward the blacksmith's forge. Leora's stomach twisted. She knew what he meant to do before anyone else did. He was going to burn the hair. He was going to turn the last piece of her dignity into ash and smoke right in front of her. Right in the hands of the man who had tried to save it. "No!" she choked out, staggering forward. But her voice was swallowed by the approving roar as the deputy returned, holding a blacksmith's brand, its tip glowing with a malevolent orange light. Hale snatched it and jabbed it toward Colt. "Drop it in the fire, Mercer, or you'll join her in shame." The deputy thrust the glowing brand closer. The heat licked at the bundle of hair in Colt's hands. Smoke began to rise. The sickening smell of singed hair filled the air. For the first time, Colt's hand shifted, not to drop the hair, but to pull it tighter against his chest, shielding it with his own body. His eyes, fixed on the sheriff, were black with a cold fury that made even the deputies take a step back. "This doesn't belong to you," Colt said, his voice low and dangerous. "It doesn't belong to the gutter, or the fire, or your badge. It belongs to her." He paused, and his next words seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. "And it stays with us." The phrase hung in the air. It stays with us. A declaration of allegiance. A line drawn in the dust. The laughter in the crowd died instantly. Leora felt her knees go weak. No one had ever included her in their us. She had always been an outsider, an object of suspicion and scorn. Now this stranger was standing in a circle of fire for her, claiming her broken pieces as his own. The crowd shifted, uneasy. They had been happy to mock a lone woman. But this was different. This was a man of quiet strength declaring something sacred. Hale, his face contorted with rage, spat on the ground. "You dare speak for her? You dare defy me in front of this whole town?" Colt didn't move. His voice was steady as the tolling of a church bell. "No, Sheriff. I don't speak for her. I speak against you." The silence that followed was absolute. The game was over. This wasn't about Leora's pride anymore. It was about the sheriff's soul. Cornered, humiliated, and seething with a fury that had nowhere else to go, Hale lost his mind. He ripped the glowing brand from his deputy's hand and lunged, thrusting the fiery tip directly at the bundle of hair Colt held. A woman screamed. Leora cried out, but Colt's free hand was a blur. It shot out, fast as a snake, and clamped around the sheriff's wrist. He caught the blow inches from his own chest. For a long, terrible moment, they were locked together, the lawman and the stranger. The brand sizzled and spat between them, casting a hellish orange glow on their faces. The crowd was a frozen tableau of horror and fascination. Then Hale roared, twisting and straining, his teeth bared. He put all his weight into it, trying to break Colt's grip. The torch hissed. Sparks flew. Colt's sleeve began to smolder. The smell of burning cloth mixed with the stench of singed hair. Leora's hands, still bound, pulled uselessly at the ropes, her throat raw from a scream that wouldn't come. Colt didn't even look at the fire eating at his arm. His eyes never left the sheriff's. With a grunt of pure, raw effort, he twisted the sheriff's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. Hale screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock. The brand fell from his limp fingers. But Colt wasn't done. In one fluid motion, he stomped his boot down on the glowing metal head, driving it deep into the dirt. He ground his heel against it, again and again, until the orange glow choked, sputtered, and died. He had put out the sheriff's fire. A collective sigh of awe and terror went through the crowd. Hale staggered back, clutching his broken wrist, his face pale and slick with sweat. His deputies just stood there, paralyzed, unwilling to move against a man who had just dismantled their leader with such brutal, quiet efficiency. Colt bent down. He picked up the bundle of hair again. The ends were blackened and singed, but the bundle itself was whole. He looked at Leora. "Still here," he murmured, his voice for her alone. And the words were a balm on her raw, bleeding soul. But the crowd wasn't ready to let go of its cruelty. Humiliating the sheriff was one thing, but letting the woman win was another. "He can't keep it," someone shouted. "Make her eat it." A fresh wave of ugly laughter erupted, trying to reclaim the moment. Hale, cradling his wrist, saw his chance. "See him!" he shrieked, his voice shrill. "He defies the badge! He assaults your sheriff!" But the words rang hollow. His power was broken. Two deputies finally made a move, but they hesitated, their eyes darting nervously at the silent, watching faces of the townsfolk. Colt didn't wait for them. He stepped back, putting himself squarely in front of Leora again. His hand rested on her shoulder, a simple, protective gesture that spoke volumes. The deputies stopped in their tracks. They saw no wild rage in his eyes, only a calm, deadly promise of violence if they took one more step. Leora lifted her chin. The fire hadn't touched her hair, but it had lit something in her. "You've taken enough," she said, her voice raspy but clear. The crowd stilled. They had expected defiance from the stranger. They had never expected it from her. Hale's last shred of control snapped. He drew his revolver again, his good hand shaking with rage. "Then you'll both swing at dawn," he screamed. The threat was empty, and everyone knew it. It was the desperate cry of a fallen tyrant. Colt's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady, but carrying to every corner of the square. "If you hang us for this, Sheriff, then this whole town will hang with you, because every one of you saw what was done, and you said nothing." His words were not an accusation. They were a mirror. And in that mirror, the people of the town saw their own ugly faces. They saw their own complicity, their own cruelty. Guilt spread through the crowd like a contagion. The sheriff's hand shook. His finger tightened on the trigger. And then a stone flew through the air. It didn't hit Colt. It didn't hit Leora. It clattered off the dusty toe of Sheriff Hale's boot. The crowd gasped. Every head snapped toward where it had come from. Hale's eyes widened in disbelief. The town was no longer just watching. It was turning. The stone was a crack of thunder in the suffocating silence. Sheriff Hale stared at his boot, then at the crowd, his face a mess of confusion and rage. "Who did that?" he bellowed. "Who dares?" No one answered, but in that collective silence, a revolution was born. They didn't need a leader. They just needed to stop being followers. Leora felt the shift in the air. The weight of 1,000 hateful eyes was lifting. People were looking down at their own feet, unable to meet her gaze. The shame she had been forced to carry was now being passed back to its rightful owners. Colt stood unmoved, the singed bundle of hair still held carefully in his hand. "This was never about the law," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This was about a man's pride and a town's cruelty." The crowd fractured. "The sheriff keeps us safe," a rancher yelled, his loyalty dying hard. "Safe from what?" Another man shot back. "A woman with long hair?" A mother clutched her child's hand, her voice trembling with dawning horror. "He told us she was sick, that her pride was a disease. He lied." The word lied shot through the crowd like a spark. Tongues were loosened, whispers became shouts. The dam of fear had broken. Hale swung his revolver toward the rising voices, his face a mask of desperation. "Quiet! All of you!" But his authority was gone. He was just a man with a gun, and the crowd was no longer afraid of him. Leora found a new strength. She pointed a trembling finger at the sheriff. "You cut my hair to shame me," she called out, her voice getting stronger with every word. "But he carries what you tried to trample. Who holds the dignity now?" The question struck the town's conscience. Hale roared in frustration. "Enough! Seize them both!" His two deputies took a half-step forward, then stopped, their eyes wide with fear as they looked at the angry faces surrounding them. They were no longer the law. They were just two men standing on the wrong side of a mob. Colt stepped toward Leora. Gently, he took the bundle of hair and placed it into her still-bound hands. His voice was firm, a pronouncement for all to hear. "It stays with us." The words sealed the sheriff's fate. Something in the crowd finally snapped. A young boy, the same one who had ground her hair into the dust, slipped away from his mother. He darted into the street, his face pale. He knelt down where the last few strands still lay scattered. He picked one up. His small hand trembled. But instead of throwing it down, he walked over to Leora and pressed the single dusty strand into her palm alongside the others. The simple act of redemption was more powerful than any speech. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt holy. It was too much for Sheriff Hale. His mind, already teetering on the edge, plunged into madness. He saw the child not as a boy, but as another traitor. He snapped the revolver toward the child. Screams erupted. Raw, terrified screams. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Men surged forward, their shock turning to pure, murderous rage. Colt's hand blurred as it dropped to his own holster. He didn't draw. Not yet. He held that single, breathless moment in his hand, a heartbeat where the whole world could either drown in blood or be saved. The sheriff's finger whitened on the trigger. The question hung in the dusty air. Would he murder a child to save his pride? The revolver glinted, a cruel star of death aimed at the heart of a child. The boy stood frozen, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was heartbreaking. But he didn't drop the single strand of hair he'd retrieved. He clutched it like a holy relic, a small, perfect act of defiance. "Back away, boy," Hale hissed, his voice ragged. "That filth, it curses everyone who touches it." The child shook his head. His voice was small, but in the dead silence, it rang out like a bell. "It's not filth," he said. "It's hers." The innocence of the words stripped away every lie, every justification. It laid the sheriff's black soul bare for the whole town to see. Colt took another step forward, his hand still resting on the butt of his gun. His voice was quiet, but it held the finality of a death sentence. "Put the gun down, Sheriff. Even you can't come back from this." The deputies were backing away now, their hands held up as if to show they were no part of this. They knew. Everyone knew. A man who shoots a child in broad daylight is no longer a man. He's a monster. But Hale's pride was a bigger monster. "He's tainted!" he shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "Just like her! I'll cleanse this whole town!" A roar of fury went up from the crowd. "You'd kill a boy over a woman's hair?" a man bellowed. The mob surged, no longer a collection of individuals, but a single, vengeful organism. Leora, her wrists still bound, found the last of her voice. "If you kill him, Hale," she screamed, "you prove I was never the unclean one. You were." Her words were the final match on the powder keg. Hale's finger squeezed the trigger, but Colt moved like lightning. He threw himself in front of the boy, his body a living shield. His shoulders were broad, his stance unbreakable. His voice cut through the pandemonium. "If you fire now, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and deadly, "you'll fire into me, and then you'll find out who this town really fears." For a terrible second, nothing happened. The sheriff, the gun, the man, the child. A frozen moment of choice. Then with a scream of pure animal rage, Hale ripped his arm upward and fired into the sky. Bang! The shot shattered the tension. Birds exploded from the eaves of the buildings. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, and the crowd broke. They surged forward like a tidal wave, their fear washed away, replaced by a righteous fury that shook the ground. Sheriff Hale stumbled back, his gun suddenly useless against the tide of his own people turning on him. "Get him!" he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Colt. A desperate, pathetic attempt to redirect their rage. It didn't work. "He's no sheriff!" a voice cried. "He's a tyrant!" screamed another. "He aimed at a child!" The accusations rained down on him. His deputies, seeing the end, threw their badges in the dust and melted into the crowd. Hale was alone. His eyes were wild, cornered. With a guttural roar, he lunged, not at Colt, but at the bundle of hair in Leora's hands. He had to destroy it. It was the symbol of his undoing. Colt intercepted him, shoving him back. But Hale was beyond reason. He stumbled, then charged again, his face a mask of madness. "You cut me down to break me, Hale!" Leora screamed over the roar of the mob. "But you only broke yourself." Her voice was the final catalyst. The crowd surged, fists raised, ready to tear him limb from limb. Desperate, Hale pulled a knife from his belt. The blade flashed in the sun. It was his last weapon, his last stand. "If I can't burn her shame," he bellowed, "I'll carve it from her myself." He lunged toward Leora. The mob shrieked in horror, but Colt was already there. He pushed the hair back into Leora's hands and stepped forward to meet the charge. The two men crashed together. The knife slashed wildly. Colt's hand shot out, catching Hale's wrist in a grip of steel. They struggled, a whirlwind of dust and desperation. The mob pressed in, a suffocating circle of rage. The knife blade trembled, inches from Colt's throat. Hale put every last ounce of his hatred into that final push. For the first time, Colt grunted with effort, his calm finally cracking to reveal the raw power beneath. The sound silenced the mob. All eyes were fixed on that sliver of steel, hovering a breath away from ending it all. The knife was a hair's breadth from Colt's skin. Sheriff Hale's face was a twisted snarl of effort, but Colt's grip was absolute. With a roar, Hale shoved forward, and the blade drew a thin line of red along Colt's jaw. It was a fatal mistake. Colt's other hand shot up and clamped around the sheriff's throat, squeezing the air and the fight out of him. He forced him backward, step by agonizing step. The mob parted before them, a sea of hate and awe. This was the end they had created. The lawman and the stranger, locked in a final, brutal dance where truth had finally cornered lies. With a final, powerful wrench, Colt twisted Hale's arm. The knife spun through the air and clattered harmlessly in the dust. Hale collapsed to his knees, choking, spitting, his power gone, his spirit broken. The roar that went up from the crowd was not a cheer of victory. It was a howl of condemnation. "Get him out of here! He's not our sheriff!" The mob started to close in, but Colt raised a hand. His chest was heaving, his jaw was bleeding, his sleeve was scorched, but his authority was absolute. And for the first time that day, the town obeyed not out of fear, but out of respect. He turned to Leora. She was trembling, still clutching the bundle of her hair. Slowly, reverently, he knelt before her. His rough fingers, stained with dirt and a little of his own blood, worked at the knots of the rope around her wrists. He didn't stop until they were free. She gasped, a sob of relief and pain, and clutched the hair to her chest as if it were her own heart. Colt's voice was low, but it carried to every person in the silent square. "They tried to scatter you. They tried to burn you, but it stays with us." The words settled over the town like a final verdict. Heads bowed. Eyes that had been filled with scorn were now filled with shame. They knew. They had been just as guilty as the sheriff. Hale staggered to his feet. No one helped him. He looked at the faces in the crowd, saw no pity, and knew he was finished. With a final, choked sob of rage, he ripped the tin badge from his chest and threw it into the dirt. Then he stumbled away, disappearing into the alleys like a ghost. A heavy silence fell, the kind that comes after a storm, when the air is clean but the wreckage is all around. Colt rose to his feet. He offered his hand to Leora. Not as a savior to a victim, but as an equal. Her hair was a ragged mess, her scalp was raw, her dress was torn. But as she took his hand, her dignity was a shining, unbreakable thing. He walked her across the square, past the spot where she had been shorn, past the dead ashes of the brand, past the tin badge lying in the filth. With every step, she held the bundle of hair tighter. It was no longer a symbol of her shame. It was the proof of her survival. At the edge of town, as the morning sun washed the dirty street in gold, Colt gently touched the bundle in her hands. "Carry them," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers. "They're yours, always." And together they walked out of that town and into the morning light, leaving behind a place that would forever be haunted by the day it tried to destroy a woman, and instead destroyed itself. If you believe that dignity is something that can never be taken, only given away, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that matter. Now I have to ask you, if you had seen her hair falling in the dust, would you have been brave enough to bend down and gather it? Let me know in the comments below.